Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week two lecture video on understanding and dealing with conflict. This is a topic that should be quite familiar to you, to me, and to all of us, because we do deal with conflict almost on a daily basis. We see a world where there's so much conflict going on, in relation to nation states, for example. Wars are going on in places like Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in a lot of other African countries as well. And closer to home, we often see conflicts in relation to politics. There are also places where there are conflicts based on religion. And even at home, it is quite unfortunate that we do have occasions where there might be family conflicts. Sometimes these family conflicts can become violent, and therefore we end up with issues of domestic violence or family violence. But at the root of all of these conflicts are differences, which we examine in this lecture video. Now, it was Benjamin Franklin who said that there are only two things in life which are certain: death and taxes. But the cynical part of me would say that there's actually a third thing that is certain in life, and that is conflict. And because, as I mentioned, you see conflict almost on a daily basis. Uh, you can even see this in the form of, road traffic and road rage. You can see these conflicts happening in schools or in workplace settings. And so it also tells us that if it were not for conflicts, there probably wouldn't be any lawyers. And that's the topic that we're covering in today's lecture video. Now, before we get there, I'm just reminded about lawyers and disputes. So this was something that I came across. Actually, I've heard about it many times. So there were three professionals talking about what was the oldest and the most ancient profession. And this was a discussion between a surgeon, an engineer, and a lawyer. And the doctor said that it had to be the doctor, uh, the medical profession, which was the oldest profession, because according to the Bible, on the fifth day of creation, God took a rib from Adam. So therefore, surgery is the oldest profession. And then the engineer said, but before that, God created the heavens and the earth from chaos. So engineering is the oldest profession. And the lawyer said, yes, but who created the chaos? So, although we may feel bad about conflict and the fact that there are disputes that go on, were it not for disputes, there probably wouldn't be the legal profession. Maybe. Now, while we're at it, while we're talking about lawyers, uh, I'm reminded of somebody telling me about the story of a lawyer. So there was a lawyer who had just gone to surgery, and as he came out of the anesthesia, he asked his doctor, why are all the blinds drawn? And the doctor said, well, there's a big fire across the street. And because of the fire, we didn't want you to wake up and think that the operation was a failure. I don't know if you got that. And so, well, there was also this instance of somebody approaching a lawyer, and he said, are you a lawyer? And the lawyer said, yes, I am. And then the person said, well, how much do you charge? And the lawyer said, $100 for 4 questions. And then this person said again, isn't that awfully expensive? And the lawyer said, yes. So what's your fourth question? Okay. Now, anyway, finally, you've probably heard about the terrorist that hijacked a 747, a jet plane that was full of lawyers. The lawyers are about to go on a convention. And he threatened to release one lawyer every hour if his demands were not met. Okay, so I'm probably bad at these about making jokes. I was thinking of it to be another possible profession, but probably not. So anyway, let's go back to the topic on understanding conflict. So On completing this topic, you should be able to discuss and explain the nature of conflict, the sources and elements of conflict, how conflict escalates, the culture and context of conflict, and several basic communication skills and tools that mediators might be able to use in relation to conflict. Now, what makes conflicts pretty vexing is it's its very nature, where if there is a conflict, and we see this again, I'm sure, in everyday life, if there's a conflict, people actually have different realities about the conflict. So if it's about a husband and wife, the husband will probably say it's my wife's fault, and then the wife will say it is your fault. And so therefore, the point there is that when there is a conflict, oftentimes what happens is that people have different realities. And this idea about different realities is often captured symbolically in that ancient parable of the elephant and the blind men. And when these blind men were trying to describe what the elephant was like, some would see it as, a jigsaw of a wall, or a fence, or a rope, a spear, a fan, and a snake, which means, again, that people tend to perceive, a single phenomenon and have different perceptions of it, end up having different realities. I'm also reminded of the notion of separate realities, because sometimes there is an experience and someone will say, oh, it was a wonderful experience. And yet to another, that person will say, it was an awful experience. So you might have a scenario where in a marriage, for example, you can have the partners being quite happy, and yet the children might feel abused. Or you might have a situation where one of the family members may think that a grandparent is good, and yet to an in-law, the grandparent, the mother-in-law, is not a good person. Again, talking about separate realities. And these are all valid realities. And it just suggests to us that we need to be aware that people have different perceptions of realities. It can often even be worse when we deal with what are known as distorted realities. Some people may distort what reality is. And I'm often reminded about the notion of gaslighting, where some people even begin to question what is real, what reality is. So the point being that every person has different subjective perceptions of what is seen, felt, and experienced. And it's not possible to just minimize and ignore these different subjective perceptions or different subjective realities, because to one person, to the person who holds that reality, it is to him or her real. And it also means that oftentimes when you deal with realities, there can be competing perspectives, one asserting that, this is what is real. And it is important from the viewpoint of a lawyer or from the viewpoint of somebody who's engaged in alternative dispute resolution to be aware that when people actually speak of realities, they're trying to compete for what to them is what to them is real. And especially when a mediator or a lawyer tries to deal with family disputes, for example, there's got to be greater awareness that spouses involved in a family conflict may in fact have different views of what reality is, and they're trying to compete and make an assertion about what is real. The other thing we also need to be mindful of is that when we speak of conflict and when we think of conflict, there might be figures actually who might not be present physically at a negotiating table or at the point where a mediator seeks to assist or facilitate a resolution between individuals. And yet there might be figures or other persons not being there, but actually have a strong influence in the way that the possibility of the dispute being resolved, will play out. And these can be family members, well-meaning friends, and workmates, etc. And that adds complexity to the idea of conflict, because conflict, again, is not just between two persons or actually disputants. It may in fact involve other individuals who may not even be there, but do have a strong influence in the way that a conflict may escalate, or a conflict may potentially be sorted out. Now, one way of trying to understand the sources of conflict would be to use Christopher Moore's sphere of conflict. And he says that there are at least 5 types of conflicts, or 5 sources of conflicts. It can be a result of relationships. It can be a result of data, interests, structural conflicts, and value conflicts. Let's begin with relationship conflict. So one source of conflict, and this is something that's pretty common to us and very, something which we're very familiar with, is that there can be conflicts in relationships because of miscommunication. It could be because of strong emotions, stereotyping, or and repetitive negative behavior. There's even the point where individuals, especially in family relationship, may end up dehumanizing another person. They might even be contempt towards another person. There is a book written by John Gottman, one of the experts on families and marriages, who says that one of the strong signs that a marriage will fail is when either party to a relationship begins to exhibit contempt towards the other. So when there is contempt, more than hatred, it is likely going to be the case that that will lead to a permanent breakdown of the marriage or the relationship. Another source of conflict will be conflicts in relation to data or in relation to information. And that's because, one, there might be a lack of information. There might be misinformation. There might also be different views on the relevance of the information or the data. And then there are different interpretations of the data or the information. That, again, is a source of conflict. So in other words, it tells us that when we're dealing with conflict, the conflict between disputants or between parties is not a result solely of differences in interests or positions. If they can be a result of conflicts in the relationship or conflicts in the data. Now, what of course is very familiar to us, especially among lawyers, would be the idea of conflicts in interests. There potentially will always be differences in terms of their perceptions or actual competition over interest. So for example, if you have a family dispute and it involves a husband and wife over a minor child, for example, of course, it's quite clear that both parents feel that they ought to be able to spend a lot of time with their child, with a child or with their children, even if the marriage breaks down. So there's clearly a conflict in terms of interest. Now, but more than that, there's also such a thing as procedural interest. So if these couple, which is about to separate, and before they go to court, filing an application for parenting orders, for example, they will also have what are known as procedural interests when they appear before a family dispute practitioner or a mediator. And when we speak of procedural interest, for example, they'll have concerns about how the process of mediation will happen, who gets to talk first, how much time they should be able to ventilate and vent about their feelings about how things should work. There'll be questions about their perceptions about the neutrality of a mediator and the objectivity of the mediator, to be able to make sure that he or she does not have any preconceived notions about any of the parties. There will of course be psychological interests as well, and these relate to issues about and very related to strong emotions, but these relate to psychological interests in saving face, in ensuring that, in relation to defamation proceedings, for example, it can be that some of these disputants may prefer to have to go to court and spend a lot of money just to prove a point, because to them it's important to be able to show that they don't want to be browbeaten by anyone, and they don't want their reputation, for example, to be tarnished by allegations or assertions from anyone else. And so to them, it's more important to go to court rather than seek a way to resolve the conflict in a more amicable manner. Now, another source of conflict, as we know, would be conflicts in terms of values. People often have different ways of looking at life, or ideologies and worldviews. In a family situation, for example, one of the biggest sources of conflict will be values around religion, values about the importance of education, values in terms of child rearing, and so on. And these conflicts in values, or even conflict values in terms of how clean should the house be, how often should who should be responsible for doing certain chores. And these particular conflicts are, of course, deep-seated, and they're often rooted in the childhood experiences of the parties. And again, it tells us that if there is a conflict, it can be rooted in values. And because values are, again, deep-seated, and they oftentimes are part of the identity of an individual, it can be quite difficult for a mediator, for example, to try to seek a resolution of a conflict solely by looking at the interests of the individuals. There has to be an acknowledgement on the part of the mediator that the conflict might be rooted in something deeper, such as a value. There will also be, in relation to value conflicts, it can also be in terms of how ideas might be evaluated. To one person, an idea might not be relevant, an idea might not be important, but to another, because an idea is rooted in value, it might even be ideological, and it's tied up, if it becomes a part of what a person considers to be an identity of who a good father is, or who a good mother is, then that becomes even more difficult to displace, and therefore there has to be greater awareness on the part of the disputants, and especially on the part of the mediator or the alternative dispute resolution practitioner, to be aware of these value conflicts. The other aspect about the source of conflict can be structural. That's in relation to unequal authority, unequal control of resources, and time constraints. So when you speak, for example, of structural conflicts, it can be rooted in the fact that there might be a person who asserts more authority on the basis of the fact that he might have more income, or he thinks and considers himself to be in a profession that ought to be accorded greater respect. And especially when one of the disputants may have greater access to resources, again, that might be a source of conflict because of the assertion that with greater resources, that person has more say on a particular matter. So again, this is a very important way by which we might try to understand the sources of conflict, and to understand that conflicts are often multi-dimensional. You should be able to see conflicts from different dimensions, from different perspectives, and realizing that these sources of conflict often interact and may be interdependent, so that when you're trying to deal with a conflict in terms of interests, these conflicts may often be compounded by the fact that there are relationship conflicts as well, or relationships in terms of data, and so on. Now, one way, so again, we already talked about the sources of conflict, but when you look deeper at the sources of conflict, whether the conflict is in relation to data or relationships or interests and so on, there are actually interests, there are actually elements to a conflict, and these elements of conflict may be in relation to interests, emotions, and values. In other words, if there is a source of conflict, it is often because in that conflict are certain elements such as interests, emotions, and values. So, and we touched upon this earlier when we talked about sources of conflict, following Christopher Moore's spheres of conflict. So when it comes to interests, this relates to those things that motivate people, both subjective and objective, and they encompass particular individual desires and also roles and status. Now, of course, when we speak of interests, oftentimes this is tied to the idea that an individual may have certain legal rights. And so when an individual talks about asserting an interest, that assertion may be on the basis that he or she perceives himself or herself to have certain legal rights that should be respected and that ought to be promoted. And in addition, what again makes conflicts become more problematic is the fact that interests are not objective. They are pretty much subjective in the sense that oftentimes they are overladen with emotions. And so when there's a perception, for example, that one's interests have not been respected, or have in fact been violated by the actions or insensitivity of another person, then there are feelings and emotions that accompany these kinds of interactions, leading to anger, resentment, fear, rejection, anxiety, and loss. So it's very seldom that when there is, for example, a legal matter or a dispute that might come before the courts, it's very seldom that the disagreement or the conflict between two or more parties is simply a result of a divergence of interests or a conflict of interests. Oftentimes, and more often than not, these conflicts in interests are amplified because of emotions that are in the way of trying to look for a resolution. And as I mentioned, for example, earlier, again, more than the questions about interests and emotions, oftentimes there are values that are actually deeply rooted in conflict. And this can be because of individual or group identity and a sense of self-worth. They can represent deeply rooted ideas about what is right and wrong, or they can be based on long-standing cultural traditions, views, and stereotypes. Now, let's examine conflict further. Again, we know that, as I mentioned, we're all familiar with conflict, but for us to be in a better position to truly understand conflict, it's always good to dig deeper into the concept and notion of conflict. And it's important as well for us to know that conflict is influenced strongly by culture as well as by context. So, for example, one of the things that influence conflict would be language and verbal communication. So somebody with English as a second language may have difficulty understanding what is said, especially if there's slang or local idiom that is used. And so therefore, in relation to conflict, it may be that conflict escalates or there's conflict in the first place because of a miscommunication, which earlier we said can be a source of conflict. It can also be perceptions about body language and nonverbal communication. And again, depending on one's culture. Remember, Australia is a multicultural society. And even if you might consider a culture coming essentially from a white English background, for example, from the UK, even these dominant cultures have subcultures based on family values or based on religion. And the point there is that depending on one's background, especially ethnic background, there will be expectations about gestures, facial expressions, and how these ought to be interpreted. So there is an importance, it's important that there has to be greater awareness about the role and the significance and impact of body language and nonverbal communication in relation to conflict. There will also be attitudes to physical space and personal boundaries, so that sometimes, for some people, maintaining eye contact is disrespectful. It might be interpreted as but in a way, for somebody not to maintain eye contact, but might also mean that, you know, a shiftiness or a lack of openness, or maybe even the potential to lie. Again, it depends, a lot depends on the culture of the parties involved. There may also be issues about approaches to a time, because in some cultures, a strict adherence to time is not seen as important. And so, for example, there might be a meeting between two potential business partners. To one, time isn't that important, so that, you know, when they agree, okay, let's meet at 6 p.m., to one person, 6 p.m. might be 7 p.m., but to another, 6 p.m. is 5 minutes prior to 6. Because to that person, time is, you know, time is wealth, time is gold. But to another, time, you know, it's pretty relative. And so there are a lot of cultures, for example, in the Philippine context, when you say we're going to meet at 3 o'clock, they'll often say, okay, is that Philippine time? Because when you say 3 p.m. and it's Philippine time, it actually means you should be meeting each other at 4 or 4:30 p.m. So if there's a meeting or there's a party and the party's at 3 p.m., you shouldn't be there at 3, you should be there at 4 or 4:30. So that's a possible approach to time. Again, differences in terms of cultures. There might also be differences in terms of approaches to problem solving and negotiation. There are some who prefer, you know, a direct and linear way of approaching a way to resolve conflict, but to others, you can't go to it directly. It means, you know, you need to do it slowly and more indirectly by, you know, doing chit chat, having how are you, how are things, talking about other things, but you're not permitted to go straight away and, you know, to talk about the conflict, because that is rude. Again, telling you that, you know, depending on the individuals involved and depending on the role of culture, the way to try to solve a problem or to negotiate would be strongly influenced and impacted by culture. There will also be attitudes towards privacy and the involvement of parties, so that to some, status or pride within an ethnic group may make it a matter that would be important, so that to them, there are certain issues which just couldn't be discussed before a stranger. And sometimes the problem there is that the mediator is considered a stranger, because he's not, you know, the mediator, he may not, the mediator wouldn't be part of the relationship between two individuals who are now in conflict. And there'll be hesitance in terms of what to divulge and what to discuss. And so there has to be greater awareness about this. There will also be questions about acceptance and compromise, acceptance of compromise and concession, because to some, to compromise means it can lead to a serious loss of faith. Because if what you're asserting is really true, if your interests are really valid, then there is no reason why you should have to compromise or to give up some of your interests. You should be able to assert what to you is your legal right. And yet, to others, the best way to reach agreement would be to compromise, to give up something in order to gain something in return. So again, there are, you know, various ways by which conflict again influences conflict and the resolution of conflict. There can also be the importance of relationship values. So parties may not be equal, and hence their contributions are not taken seriously or seen as worthy of consideration. And sometimes when it comes to relationship values, differences in terms of gender, differences in terms of age, you know, when somebody's older or when somebody's younger, that kind of an impact on the way that conflict is perceived in a lot of societies. For example, those individuals who are more senior, who are older, are intended to be given greater respect. In some societies, it's traditional to address somebody older than you or somebody who occupies a position of respect, because that person may be in a good profession or whatever, has to be called sir or has to be called ma'am. But of course, in countries such as Australia and New Zealand, you need to be able to address people, regardless of who they are, even if that person might be the prime minister, by their first name. And of course, finally, we talk about the role of lawyers and professional advisors. Of course, when we talk about lawyers and professional advisors, these are often individuals or experts who are given high status, so that when a lawyer says that this is the law, then oftentimes, individuals will accord that statement coming from a lawyer with great respect. But that is not always true, because there can be individuals who may not be very trusting of lawyers, or who've had a very bad experience with lawyers, so that to them, a lawyer is somebody who should be avoided. A lawyer is somebody who you couldn't trust. So again, there is that the influence of culture and context in relation to conflict. Now, so we've talked about the sources of conflict, the multi dimensions of conflict, the various realities that people may have about conflict, and so on. Now, one thing we should also explore would be the escalation of conflict, because what might begin to be a small conflict can, as we often know, escalate into something worse. And I'd like to share with you a movie clip from the movie Untouchables. And these are going to be very quick, but it tells you something about escalation of conflict.
You said you wanted to know how to get to. You really want to get him. You see what I'm saying? What are you prepared to do?
Everything within the law.
And then what are you prepared to do? If you open the ball on these people, Mr. Nash, you must be prepared to go all the way. Because they won't give up the fight until one of you is dead.
I want to get Capone. I don't know how to get him.
Want to get Capone? Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way. That's how you get Capone.
Okay. So the point being that sometimes conflict escalates because once there is a person who does something, there is the expectation on the part of the other that there has to be a way of providing a counterattack or providing a response that is appropriate to that which has been shown by one of the adversaries. And this can often mean that they end up increasing the stakes so that the conflict escalates. So let's examine how conflict can escalate. The conflict regarding a case can often begin with just a tension, and then there will be debates, and then there's an attempt at avoidance. But sometimes, at some point, if the conflict escalates, that it can lead to an attack, and that attack can lead to a loss of face, and then there will be threats. And when you reach the point where there are threats, it can lead to destructive behavior, an attempt. It can also lead to an elimination of the adversary or an elimination of options. And so that at some point, you go to the point where it's a point of no return. It's almost like burning your bridges. And that's where that's one way of looking at how conflict escalates. Another way of looking at conflict would be the escalation of conflict, that you begin with a disagreement. Individuals see things differently, but then at some point, it's not just about seeing things differently. What then happens is that you personify the problem, you personify the cause of the problem, so that instead of just focusing on the behavior or a source of disagreement, one individual says, it is your fault. So it's going beyond the source of disagreement or conflict, and then focusing on the other person as the one responsible for the conflict. The problem can then expand, and that person would then say, this is not the first time. Do you remember, when you did this as well? And so moving away from that single incident of a conflict or disagreement, the past is then brought into the equation, so that it's no longer just a single conflict. There are now multiple sources of conflict. And then when that happens, and this can relate to disagreements between spouses, for example, probably heading towards separation and divorce. When the problem expands and there's already a personification, it's your fault, or this isn't the first time we've done this, you've done this before. At some point, one of the parties will say, what's the use of entering into dialogue? What's the use of trying to look for a solution when you look at me this way? And worse, at some point, remember I talked about John Gottman's view about contempt as a signal that a relationship is likely to be permanently damaged and will break down. At some point, there is the view of the other person as the enemy. This person is no longer good enough for me. This person is bad. This person is evil. So moving away from an action, from an activity, moving away from that single incident of a source of conflict, that incident, that conflict, that behavior is now looked at as, a reflection of what type of person the other one is. So, and that worse, the person who used to be a partner, the person whom you used to love, even becomes your enemy. And you know how difficult it can be to try to resolve a conflict when the other person is an enemy, more than just a question of being an adversary. And so that at some point it escalates further, because there would then be open hostility. So so at some point it may just be one person trying to denigrate another. It may just be one person looking at another with contempt. But at some point, there will become open hostility by both parties. And when there is open hostility, they can then say the end justify the means. They'd be willing to do anything, just to prove a point. And so that finally there will be polarization. And that actually means that it's that point where there's simply no point. There's no point of return, the point of no return, because people are so polarized, they become so alienated from each other. It just becomes really difficult to bring them back together for the purpose of seeking a resolution. So we need to be aware, therefore, that what appears to be a minor disagreement can escalate into something that is difficult to repair. Now, let's look at the role of the mediator and language. We use the mediator as an example of how a mediator might approach a conflict situation. Now, we're going to be looking at mediation as an alternative dispute resolution, I think, in week 3, or is it week 4? But just quickly, when you speak of mediation, for example, as an alternative dispute resolution, the mediator is actually somebody who's independent, and the goal of the mediator is to facilitate an agreement or a settlement between the parties. And because the goal of the mediator is mainly facilitative, the mediator tries to facilitate the parties to identify their differences, their sources of conflict, assess options, look at interests, and trying to negotiate an agreement to resolve the dispute. The mediator does not have to be somebody with an expert background, for example, in the law. The important role of a mediator is somebody who's able to get the parties to try to discuss and explore possible ways by which an agreement or settlement could be reached. And so using that example of the mediator, let's talk about the role of reframing. So one of the important things that a mediator would do is to reframe terms that are often absolute or negative or legalistic terms into language that is more neutral and more positive. So instead of saying, instead of looking at somebody as the enemy or the opponent and so on, there will have to be an attempt at a more neutral language, probably saying that, that in relation to one of the parties, just referring to his or her name instead of saying, somebody who is as an adversary or as an opponent. Instead of talking about conflicts or disputes, you probably use the term that there is a problem or there is a situation. Because again, conflict, when you say that we have a conflict, there's a conflict between us or there's a conflict between you, the use of that word alone will already connote and raise, it's already emotionally laden, and it can lead to greater anger or resentment between the parties. Instead of asking the parties to rate the facts, because remember, there are always multiple dimensions to facts and realities. It may be better for the mediator to say, are you able to share with us your perception or your understanding of what transpired? Instead of saying we will try to reach an agreement, you probably say, let's try to hold discussions. Let's try to make decisions. Instead of talking about negotiations, which again, when you say we're trying to negotiate, it often means that people have different positions, they're adversarial, and that can often make it quite difficult to arrive at a settlement. So the one approach might be, why don't we enter into discussions? Instead of saying, this is the position, this is his claim, it might be better for the mediator to say, okay, this is his or her viewpoint, this is the way he or she sees things. Instead of suggesting, why don't we enter into a compromise? Or why don't I ask you to give concessions? The mediator will say, I would suggest that this is one approach that we can take, and so on. Now, because the role of the mediator focuses a lot on facilitation, trying to facilitate a discussion between the parties for them to reach an agreement. It is and remember, the mediator is not a judge. The mediator does not determine what the outcome should be. The mediator actually tries to facilitate an outcome that comes out of the discussions between the parties. So the mediator will say, this is what the outcome will be. The mediator does not have that power. The mediator does not have an authority to compel any of the participants to enter into a binding agreement. And because the role of the mediator is mainly trying to facilitate a discussion between disputants, then it's important that the mediator engages in what is known as active listening. So what it means is that listening is actually an active process. It's also an active skill. It is not passive. And it requires more than hearing a verbal message from another party. And it also means that it is important to watch the nonverbal cues of the speaker, which can include body posture, hand gestures, eye movement, and facial expression. So the mediator engages in active listening, will listen attentively to the verbal message, will watch for the nonverbal messages, give undivided attention to the speaker, and be empathic to the speaker's emotions. The mediator, as I mentioned, would be looking carefully at the nonverbal language, the nonverbals, so that oftentimes body language is more important because it reveals the truth about people. More than what is said, body language actually speaks volumes. And when you speak about language, the language that people speak comprises, therefore, both verbal and nonverbal expressions. And nonverbal language can include physical body language, such as a party's postures, gestures, eye movements, facial expressions, and even breathing patterns. They may also include the way a party moves a chair or rearranges items on the table to create some sort of barrier between them and the other party and or the dispute resolution practitioner. And therefore, the skilled practitioner will not dismiss these things, these nonverbals, as trivial. And so with that, on completing this topic, you should be able to discuss and explain the nature of conflict, the sources and elements of conflict, how conflict escalates, the culture and context of conflict, and several basic communication skills and tools for mediators. And with that, thanks for watching this lecture video. And my name is Manjo Oysen. Thank you. Bye.